The 20th of February 1942, 3:42 p.m., Coral Sea, 450 miles northeast of Rabaul. The sound of the USS Lexington's radar cuts through the air like a knife, an electronic pip-pip-pip that makes the operator's blood run cold. His hands tremble over the controls as he adjusts the screen, praying it's a glitch, interference, anything but the reality materializing before his eyes. A jagged formation on the horizon, slicing the sky like saw teeth. 8 glowing dots approaching at attack speed. Japanese Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers, each carrying a torpedo powerful enough to tear the Lexington's hull like soaked paper. The acrid stench of burned oil and high-octane aviation fuel mixes with the cold sweat running down the sailors' backs, creating a dense atmosphere of fear and tension that clings to the skin like sticky varnish. The carrier's deck vibrates and groans under the weight of Pratt & Whitney R-1830 twin Wasp engines roaring to life, each cylinder spitting fire and smoke as the Grumman F-4F Wildcats are rushed to the catapult with desperate urgency. The metal deck is hot under the tropical sun, but the sharp wind of the South Pacific brings a chill that cuts to the bone. Sailors dart back and forth like ants in a raided anthill, shouting orders lost in the deafening roar of engines. The smell of gunpowder, engine oil, and human sweat creates an olfactory cocktail that marks the moments before battle. 2 pilots dash toward their fighters, their leather boots pounding the non-slip deck metal like war drums. One of them is Lieutenant Edward Henry O'Hare, 28 years old, the son of a lawyer from Street Louis who had worked for Al Capone until he was assassinated 3 years earlier. Butch O'Hare had joined Squadron VF-3 7 months earlier, and since day one, he had heard the whispers of veterans spreading through the carrier's corridors like poison. Just another rich kid from Street Louis, they'd say when they thought he wasn't listening. Daddy bought his graduation from the Naval Academy. Let's see how long he lasts when the bullets start flying. The words stuck to his consciousness like tar, creating a wound that bled every time he saw the disdainful looks on the more experienced pilots' faces. They saw in him everything they despised: privilege, money, an easy life that had never known real need or true danger. What they didn't know was that Butch carried his own scars, his own doubts, gnawing at his confidence like acid. His childhood in Street Louis had been a confusing mix of luxury and latent violence. The family mansion on Forest Park Boulevard was a world of Persian rugs and baccarat crystals, but also of nervous whispers about dad's business and nighttime visits from men in suits who spoke in code. Edward Joseph O'Hare was a brilliant lawyer who had chosen to represent the most dangerous man in America, Al Capone. The money that paid for the best schools, for shooting lessons, for summer vacations on Lake Michigan, came directly from the illegal dealings of Chicago's most infamous gangster. Butch grew up knowing his father walked a tightrope between law and crime, and that one day the rope would snap. When it finally did, on the 8th of November 1939, Edward Joseph was gunned down in his Cadillac on the way home, a week before Al Capone was released from prison. The message was clear: traitors pay the ultimate price. At 13, Butch was sent to Western Military Academy, where he learned discipline and discovered his natural talent for shooting. He spent hours on the range, perfecting his aim until he could hit coins tossed in the air. But marksmanship didn't erase the doubts growing inside him like weeds. Was he truly strong, or just a privileged boy playing soldier? The Naval Academy at Annapolis had been 4 years of constant effort to prove his worth, but the doubts lingered, fed by his peers' comments and the persistent feeling that he was an imposter wearing a uniform he didn't deserve. 2 years serving on the battleship USS New Mexico had taught discipline and routine, but hadn't tested his courage under real fire. Now, as he ran toward the Wildcat that could become his coffin, Butch felt the moment of truth had finally arrived. The salty wind of the South Pacific slashed Butch's face like razors as he climbed into the cramped cockpit of his Wildcat F4 F3 serial number 3976, which had become an extension of his own body over the past months. The leather seat was too hot under the tropical sun, sticking to his skin through the flight suit. His hands trembled as he adjusted the safety harness, but not from the cold. The thermometer read 84 degrees Fahrenheit. It was pure adrenaline mixed with the primal fear every fighter pilot learns to carry as a survival tool. The 1,200 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R-183076 twin Wasp roared to life with a vibration that traveled through every bone in his body, making the instruments on the panel shake like leaves in the wind. The familiar scent of 100-octane aviation fuel, hot mobile oil, and heated leather filled his lungs, bringing that nauseating mix of fear and excitement that preceded every combat mission. Beside him, separated by just 20 feet of metal deck, Lieutenant Marion Duff Dufilho was checking his own instruments with the same desperate urgency, his hands flying over the controls in a dance rehearsed thousands of times in training, but now carrying the weight of real life and death. Dufilho was a Pensacola veteran, a pilot with 2 years of flight experience who had embraced Butch as a younger brother since his arrival to the squadron. But today they were just two men against a force that could send the Lexington and its 2,900 crew to the ocean floor in a matter of minutes. The weight of that responsibility was physical, like a granite stone on his chest, growing heavier by the second. The acrid smell of gunpowder soaked everything, mixed with the metallic, animal stench of fear that he knew, as well as his own face in the mirror. Butch adjusted the leather helmet's microphone close to his lips and heard the tense voice of the flight controller crackling in his headset. Tiger 1 and Tiger 2, you've got bogeys at 12 miles. Altitude 10,000 feet, speed 240 knots, vector 040. Good hunting. The phrase good hunting sounded like a cruel joke. 2 Wildcats against 8 Bettys was mathematically calculated suicide. Each Mitsubishi G4M carried a 1,760-pound Type 91 torpedo capable of tearing a house-sized hole in the Lexington's hull. If just 2 of those torpedoes hit, the Navy's newest carrier would join the Arizona's wreckage at the ocean floor. Butch thought of Rita, his wife, whom he had met at the hospital in Phoenix, where she worked as a nurse. He remembered the smell of her hair, the way she laughed when he tried to impress her with Naval Academy stories. If he died today, she would receive a folded flag and a standard telegram from the Department of the Navy. The catapult launched with enough force to break bones, and Butch felt his internal organs compress against his ribs as the Wildcat accelerated from 0 to 85 knots in under 3 seconds. The sensation was like being hit by a moving train, every muscle and tendon straining against the G-force, trying to crush his body into the back of the cockpit. His teeth slammed together, biting his tongue, and the metallic taste of blood mixed with the thick saliva of fear. The ocean rushed under the wheels in a terrifying moment where it felt like the plane would disintegrate, and then they were airborne, climbing toward the clear blue sky where 8 Japanese bombers flew toward what they considered an easy target. The roar of the Wright Cyclone engine turned into a symphony of death, each cylinder pumping fuel and air in a controlled explosion, carrying them to meet fate. At 1,500 feet, Butch spotted the Japanese formation for the first time, and his heart nearly stopped. 8 dark specks against the crystal blue Pacific sky, flying in perfect V formation like migrating geese, but carrying enough death to change the course of the war. The Mitsubishi G4M Bettys were beautiful planes in their sinister way, with sleek fuselages and 82-foot wingspans that gave them intercontinental range. But Butch knew their weaknesses: unarmored fuel tanks that exploded like bombs when hit, and limited defensive armament consisting of 2 7.7mm Type 92 machine guns mounted in dorsal and ventral turrets. The wind whistled through the poorly sealed cockpit panels, bringing the icy scent of altitude and the metallic taste that comes when oxygen starts thinning. His eyes watered behind the flight goggles, but he couldn't afford to blink for more than a second. There was his chance to prove he wasn't just a rich kid from Street Louis playing war. That was the moment that would define who he really was. By the way, which moment from World War II moves you the most? Tell me in the comments. The communication system between the planes crackled with Dufilho's tense voice. Tiger 1, my guns are jammed. Repeat, my guns are jammed. The sentence hit Butch like an axe. The locking mechanism of Dufilho's .450 caliber Browning M2 machine guns had frozen, likely due to moisture condensation from the tropical humidity combined with the altitude and flight vibrations. It was a known failure of the Wildcat's hydraulic system when exposed to extreme changes in temperature and humidity. Dufilho signaled through the cockpit, pointed at his silent guns, and shook his head with a desperate expression that Butch could clearly see through the oxygen mask. In seconds that felt like hours, Dufilho banked his plane sharply left and vanished toward the Lexington, taking with him the only hope of support Butch had. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the constant roar of the Pratt & Whitney engine and the wind slicing across the plane's control surfaces. Now, alone at 10,000 feet above the Coral Sea, with 8 Japanese bombers flying inexorably toward the largest aircraft carrier in the American fleet, Butch felt all the doubts and insecurities of a lifetime converge into this singular moment. He looked at the Japanese formation through the Mark 8 telescopic sight mounted on the panel, and something strange happened in his chest. It wasn't fear. It was a cold, crystalline clarity he had never experienced before, as if all the confusing pieces of his life finally aligned into a pattern that made sense. They had mocked the rudder cable, doubted his courage, questioned whether he deserved to wear the uniform of the United States Navy. Now it was time to prove once and for all who Edward Henry O'Hare truly was. His childhood in Street Lewis had been a cruel paradox of privilege and constant danger. The family mansion on Forest Park Boulevard was a marble and mahogany palace where Butch grew up, surrounded by Irish nannies, uniformed chauffeurs, and gardeners whispering in Italian. But it was also a besieged fortress where armed men discreetly guarded the gates, the windows were bulletproof, and his mother Selma obsessively checked the locks before bed. The smell of Cuban cigars and Irish whiskey lingered in his father's office, mixed with the expensive perfume of secretaries and the metallic, threatening odor emanating from the nighttime visitors who spoke in codes about business a boy shouldn't understand. Edward Joseph O'Hare was a divided man, a brilliant Harvard-educated lawyer by day, consigliere to Chicago's crime kingpin by night. The money that paid for the best schools, racehorses, and summer vacations in Cape Cod was laundered through the blood and fear of Chicago's streets. Butch discovered the truth about Dad's business at 12 when he accidentally overheard a phone conversation between his father and Al Capone. The gangster's raspy voice oozed from the receiver like liquid poison. "Eddie, my boy, you keep me out of jail. I keep your family breathing. Fair deal, right?" That night, Butch lay on his king-size bed surrounded by polo trophies and marksmanship certificates and felt the safe world of childhood collapse like a house of cards. His father wasn't just a prosperous attorney. He was the right-hand man of the most dangerous man in America, the man who had turned Chicago into a war zone where Thompson submachine guns settled business disputes and bodies showed up in the Chicago River every week. The privilege Butch had known his whole life was built on a foundation of violence and corruption that could collapse at any moment. Western Military Academy was a desperate attempt at normalcy, but even there, at 13, Butch carried the weight of the family's secret like a stone in his gut. The other cadets came from respectable families, bankers, industrialists, retired military officers. They spoke openly about their father's businesses during dinner. Butch learned to dodge questions, inventing vague stories about investments and legal consulting to explain his family's wealth without revealing its true origin. It was at military school that he discovered his natural talent for shooting, spending hours alone at the range until he could hit dimes tossed in the air. Marksmanship became his escape valve, the only place where he could completely control the outcome through discipline and practice. Every perfect shot was a small victory against the chaos and uncertainty that ruled the rest of his life. Naval Academy in Annapolis had been 4 years of constant effort to reinvent himself, to prove that Edward Henry O'Hare was more than just the son of a corrupt lawyer. But the ghosts of the past followed him like shadows. His fellow cadets came from honored military dynasties, sons of admirals, grandsons of Civil War heroes, descendants of families who had served America with distinction for generations. When they spoke of family tradition and military honor, Butch felt like an imposter at a party where he wasn't invited. His grades were excellent, his physical performance flawless, but doubt corroded his confidence like acid. During the solemn ceremonies in the Chapel of Annapolis, as naval hymns echoed through granite walls etched with the names of heroes killed in action, Butch wondered if he would ever be worthy of joining that sacred tradition. 2 years serving on the battleship USS New Mexico had been an education in the brutal reality of naval life. The 32,000-ton warship was a floating steel city where 1,400 men lived in tight quarters that constantly smelled of diesel, sweat, and peeling paint. Butch learned to sleep in the officer's bunk in a closet-sized cabin, rocked by the constant drone of Westinghouse engines and the footsteps of men who never slept. He learned to eat salted ham and canned beans while the ship rolled in rough seas that made grown men vomit for days. More importantly, he learned that the Navy was not about romance or glory, but about relentless discipline, hard work, and the ability to function as part of a greater machine even when every fiber of your being screamed to run. But even after 2 years proving himself as a competent gunnery officer, the doubts persisted, whispering in his mind during long night watches, "Are you truly brave? Or just a rich boy playing soldier?" The reality of the situation hit Butch like a punch to the stomach. He was alone, 10,000 feet in the air, flying a fighter that was technically inferior to the Japanese Zeros in almost every way, facing 8 heavy bombers carrying enough firepower to destroy the most important ship in the American Pacific Fleet. The Grumman F-4 F-3 Wildcat was a sturdy but outdated plane designed in 1936 when a top speed of 331 miles per hour seemed impressive. Now, in 1942, it was outclassed by the Mitsubishi A6M0 in speed, maneuverability, and service ceiling. But it had advantages that Butch had learned to exploit during months of intensive training under Commander John Jimmy Thatch. It was heavier, better armored, and its 4.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns could shred any Japanese aircraft if he could get a clean burst at effective range. The problem was getting close enough to use that advantage without being shot down by the Betty's defensive gunners or the escorting Zeros that would surely appear once the first shot was fired. Butch checked his ammunition for the third time. 2,400 rounds total, 600 per gun, loaded with a mix of armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer bullets that could penetrate up to 1 inch of steel plating. It wasn't much against 8 bombers. Every shot had to count, every burst had to be lethal, because he likely wouldn't get a second chance. He inhaled deeply through the oxygen mask, taking in the familiar smell of vulcanized rubber and heated metal from the cockpit, and checked the flight controls one last time. Left aileron, responsive. Right aileron, responsive. Rudder, firm. Elevator, sensitive. The plane was an extension of his own body. Every vibration of the engine transmitted through the stick directly to his hands. Every change in exhaust tone registered in his ears, like deadly music. Butch had obsessively studied the intelligence reports on the Mitsubishi G4M Betty during long nights at sea. It was a medium-range bomber with an 82-foot wingspan and a 65-foot length, powered by 2 Mitsubishi Keisei radial engines of 1,530 horsepower each, giving it a top speed of 264 miles per hour and an operational range of 2,650 miles. Its payload was lethal, a 1,760-pound Type 91 torpedo mounted externally, or up to 2,200 pounds of conventional bombs in the internal bay. But the plane had fatal weaknesses that Japanese designers had accepted in exchange for range and speed. Unarmored fuel tanks that exploded like firebombs when punctured, a relatively light structure that disintegrated under heavy fire, and limited defensive armament of only 3 7.7 millimeters Type 92 machine guns, 1 in the nose, 1 dorsal, 1 ventral. It was like a boxer with powerful fists but a glass jaw. Commander Thatch had taught the VF-3 pilots that the key to defeating the enemy was to exploit blind spots and attack where the adversary least expected. The Bettys had several vulnerabilities, directly underneath, where the ventral machine gun couldn't fire without hitting its own engines, on the flanks, where only 1 gun could be brought to bear, and directly in front, where the bomber was completely defenseless. But attacking from these blind zones required dangerous approach. Flying through a storm of hot lead where a single 7.7 millimeters round in the wrong place could ignite the fuel tank or sever a vital control line. Butch chose his tactic. Multiple attacks from different directions, keeping the bombers disoriented and their gunners unable to focus effective defensive fire. The first strike came from above and behind, diving like a hawk on its prey. Butch pushed the stick forward and felt the Wildcat respond instantly, the nose pointing downward at a 45-degree angle that made the horizon spin violently. Speed climbed rapidly, 280 miles per hour, 300, 320, approaching terminal velocity where controls would begin to dangerously stiffen. The wind howled through the cockpit like a wounded animal, and the increasing vibration made his teeth chatter against the rubber guard on the microphone. He aimed at the rightmost Betty in the formation, a plane painted in matte olive green with the red rising sun glowing on the wings like drops of dried blood. At 500 yards, the Japanese rear gunners began spitting fire, red tracers slicing through the air around the canopy like deadly fireflies. Butch held his course steady, resisting every primal instinct, screaming at him to veer away from that hell of molten metal. At 300 yards, he squeezed the trigger mounted on the stick and felt the Wildcat jolt as if struck by a giant hammer. The 4 Browning M2 machine guns roared like thunder, each firing 750 rounds per minute in a symphony of destruction that could be heard even above the roar of the engine. He watched as the tracer rounds cut through the air like blades of orange light, converging on a deadly point 250 yards ahead, the distance at which all 4 guns were harmonized for maximum destructive power. The 50 caliber rounds pounded the Japanese bomber like metallic hail, piercing the thin fuselage, slicing through fuel lines and control cables, shredding the cockpit where 2 men fought desperately to keep the aircraft aloft. The first Betty exploded instantly in a ball of orange and black fire that engulfed the right engine and spread like liquid napalm along the wing. The burning debris, engine parts, wing fragments, pieces that had once been human beings fell toward the ocean like a rain of molten metal, leaving only a black smear of oily smoke marking where the bomber had existed seconds earlier. Butch yanked back on the stick and felt 7 Gs compress his body into the leather seat like a giant hand trying to crush him. His eyes filled with tears, peripheral vision dimmed, and he had to consciously fight to keep blood flowing to his brain. His hands sweated inside his leather gloves, slipping on the damp controls, and he could taste the metallic tang of blood in his mouth where he had bitten his tongue during the violent maneuver. The rudimentary G-suit he wore under his flight suit helped a little, but couldn't completely prevent the sensation that his internal organs were being rearranged by an invisible force. He banked hard left, using the speed from his dive to set up for a second attack, and quickly looked back to assess the results. 1 Betty destroyed, 7 still heading toward the Lexington. Not enough. The second attack came from the other side, this time from below upward, a maneuver Thach called a zoom attack, using the speed gained in the initial dive to climb rapidly and strike from an angle the Japanese gunners wouldn't expect. Butch had learned that surprise was everything in aerial combat. The more time enemy gunners had to track a target and calculate deflection, the lower the attacker's chances of survival. He came up beneath the Japanese formation like a shark hitting a school of fish, exploiting the ventral blind spot where the Betty's lower gun couldn't fire without risking its own engines. At 400 yards, he pulled the nose up and targeted the second bomber in the formation, this one painted in green and brown camouflage, mimicking tropical jungle colors. The dorsal guns opened up, but the deflection was too steep for accurate shots. The second burst lasted 3 seconds and consumed nearly 300 rounds, but each bullet hit with surgical precision. The 50 caliber armor-piercing rounds punched through the bomber's main fuel tank like needles through paper, and the incendiaries did the rest. The Betty disintegrated in an explosion that lit up the sky in a blinding flash, a miniature supernova of vaporized fuel and overheated metal that sent shockwaves through the Japanese formation. Butch flew through the edge of the fireball, feeling the searing heat even through the closed cockpit, his instruments rattling violently as the pressure wave shook the Wildcat like a toy. Burning debris ricocheted off the armored windshield, leaving gouges in the laminated glass that distorted his vision. 2 victories. But 6 Bettys were still flying inexorably toward the Lexington, and he could see they were getting dangerously close to the point where they could release their torpedoes with a reasonable chance of hitting. The third attack was the riskiest Butch had ever attempted in his entire flying career. With 6 bombers still inbound to the Lexington and his ammunition down to fewer than 1,800 rounds, he needed to break the Japanese formation before they reached torpedo drop range. He decided on a maneuver no flight manual would ever recommend, and his instructors at Pensacola would have called sheer suicide, flying straight through the center of the enemy formation, relying on speed and the element of surprise to penetrate the Japanese lines before they could concentrate defensive fire. It was a kamikaze tactic executed by an American pilot, betting everything on a single bold move that could either save the Lexington or turn Butch into an oily stain in the ocean. He dove once more, building up speed until the Wildcat trembled on the edge of aerodynamic stall, then pulled up violently, pointing the nose straight at the heart of the Japanese formation. At 600 yards, all 6 remaining Bettys opened fire simultaneously, creating a storm of tracers that turned the air between the planes into a deadly web of molten metal. Butch flew straight through that barrage, feeling bullets punch into the Wildcat's fuselage with metallic clangs that echoed through the cockpit like hail on a tin roof. The acrid smell of burned gunpowder and scorched electrical wiring filled the cockpit, mixed with the sharp odor of heated metal and vaporized fuel. A 7.7 millimeters round pierced the windshield 2 inches from his head, creating a perfectly round hole in the laminated glass that whistled with the high-altitude wind. But he stayed on course, aiming at the lead bomber, a newer Betty painted in naval bluish-gray with golden command markings on the wings. It was likely the formation leader's aircraft, possibly a veteran with years of experience over China and the Dutch East Indies. Killing the leader would be like cutting off the snake's head, leaving the other bombers without tactical coordination at the critical moment of attack. At 200 yards, an absurdly close distance for aerial combat, where collision was as likely as a kill, Butch squeezed the trigger and held it for a full 3 seconds. The Browning machine guns unleashed nearly 400 rounds in a concentrated burst that sliced the Japanese bomber in half. The fuselage split just behind the cockpit, releasing a cascade of vaporized fuel that ignited instantly, creating an explosion so violent that the shockwave cracked the Wildcat's windshield and made his ears bleed. Butch flew through the cloud of burning debris, engine parts, and human fragments ricocheting off his aircraft's fuselage like macabre hail. He emerged on the other side of the explosion with his heart pounding so fast he could barely breathe, adrenaline rushing through his veins like liquid acid. 3 bombers downed. 3 Japanese crews, 18 men in total, turned into vapor and molten metal. Each one had a family, dreams, fears. Each had woken up that morning thinking they would return home. Now they were just statistics in a war that turned human beings into numbers on a report sheet. The weight of that reality hit Butch like a punch to the gut. But there was no time for remorse or philosophical reflection. 5 Bettys were still flying toward the Lexington, dangerously close to the torpedo drop zone. The Japanese formation was now completely disorganized, the surviving pilots clearly shaken by the ferocity of the lone American fighter's attack. 2 of the bombers tried to gain altitude, probably hoping to escape, while the other 3 continued toward the aircraft carrier in a desperate attempt to complete the mission. Butch chose the one closest to the Lexington and made his 4th attack run, this time a head-on approach that required perfect timing and absolute nerves of steel. It was the most dangerous maneuver a fighter pilot could attempt, flying directly into the concentrated fire of defensive machine guns while trying to hit a target closing in at a combined speed of over 600 miles per hour. The world shrank into crystalline seconds, the growing roar of approaching engines, the strobing flash of machine guns spitting death, the metallic smell of fear mixed with burnt cordite, and then the almost orgasmic sight of another Betty disintegrating under his bursts. The 4th bomber exploded so close that Butch felt the heat of the blast through the sealed cockpit, and flaming debris ricocheted off the already damaged windshield, creating a web of cracks that made forward visibility nearly impossible. He was forced to look through the cockpit's side windows, flying more by instinct and instruments than direct vision. 4 confirmed kills. A 5th Betty visibly damaged, breaking from formation with its left engine, spewing black smoke and leaving a trail of vaporized fuel that shimmered like liquid silver in the tropical sun. That one likely wouldn't make it home. The remaining 3 bombers, their pilots now completely demoralized, attempted to continue the attack, but without coordination and with their leader dead, their bombs and torpedoes fell far from the Lexington, creating white columns of water in the blue ocean that harmed nothing but a few fish. The Japanese attack had completely failed. 8 Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers, each costing over $200,000 and representing months of specialized crew training, had been neutralized by a single American pilot flying a fighter that was technically inferior to the best Japanese aircraft. But the cost of victory was evident in Butch's Wildcat. 104 bullet holes perforated the fuselage, the windshield was shattered, the hydraulic system was leaking fluid from multiple points, and the Pratt & Whitney engine was running irregularly, coughing and spitting oil like a wounded man struggling to breathe. He had used 1,800 rounds of ammunition, 75% of his total supply, and the fuel gauge showed only 15 minutes of flight time remaining before the tank ran dry. The return trip to the Lexington was a nightmare of growing tension and failing equipment. The radio had been destroyed by a Japanese bullet, leaving Butch with no communication to the carrier. The altimeter was swinging wildly, likely due to damage to the static pressure line. The oil temperature indicator showed dangerously high readings, suggesting the lubrication system had been compromised. But the worst part was the silence. After 20 minutes of combat where every second had been filled with engine roars, machine gun flashes, and deafening explosions, the relative silence of the return flight allowed thoughts to creep back in. Butch couldn't stop seeing the faces of the Japanese pilots in the moments before their aircraft exploded. Young men like him, with families waiting at home, who had died because they made their choices and he had made his. The USS Lexington appeared on the horizon like a saving vision, its teakwood deck contrasting with the deep blue of the Pacific. But landing with the damage the Wildcat had suffered would be almost as dangerous as the combat he had just survived. The hydraulic system that operated the flaps and landing gear was working with reduced pressure, which meant the controls responded more slowly and required more physical force to operate. The cracked windshield distorted visibility, forcing Butch to land mostly by looking through the cockpit's side windows. But the experience of hundreds of training landings prevailed, and the Wildcat touched down on the carrier's deck with a dull thud that reverberated through the steel hull. When he shut off the engine and removed his leather helmet, Butch was instantly surrounded by a crowd of sailors cheering and clapping as if he were a movie hero. Flight mechanics rushed to examine the damage to the Wildcat, counting bullet holes and whistling in admiration at the fact that the plane could still fly. Senior officers appeared on deck, including Captain Frederick Sherman and the Air Wing commander, all wanting to hear first-hand details of the battle that had saved their ship. But Butch could barely speak. The adrenaline that had sustained him during the fight was dissipating, leaving behind a physical and emotional exhaustion that seemed to drain the strength from his bones. His hands trembled uncontrollably, and he had to sit on the deck for a few minutes before he could stand without staggering. That night, lying in his narrow bunk, listening to the hypnotic hum of the Lexington's engines slicing through the South Pacific waves, Butch thought of his father, Edward Joseph O'Hare, who had been murdered 3 years earlier in a carefully planned ambush in Chicago. His father had lived a life divided between light and darkness, between legal respectability and criminal complicity, between love for family and the need to survive in a world where violence settled business disputes. In the end, Edward Joseph had chosen to do the right thing, providing evidence that helped the federal government convict Al Capone of tax evasion. That choice had cost him his life, but it had cleared the family name and given his son a chance to become something better than his birth circumstances suggested. Now, Butch understood he had inherited more from his father than he had realized. Not just the ability to make hard decisions under extreme pressure, but also the capacity to sacrifice for a greater principle. Today, over the Coral Sea, he had faced his own version of the choice that destroyed his father. Remain safe and let others take the risk, or enter the danger zone and do what was necessary, regardless of personal cost. Like his father, he had chosen the harder path. And like his father, he knew that choice would change him forever. The privileged boy from Street. Louis had died today, somewhere between the explosions and the screams of tearing metal. In his place stood a man who understood the true weight of responsibility and the real price of honor. The following weeks were a blur of interviews, photographs, and ceremonies. On the 21st of April 1942, Butch O'Hare was received at the White House by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in a ceremony broadcast nationwide by radio. His wife Rita, nervous and proud in her best blue dress, placed the Congressional Medal of Honor around her husband's neck as the president watched with a smile that couldn't hide the worry in his eyes. Roosevelt knew, as all military leaders knew, that the United States was losing the war in the Pacific. Pearl Harbor had only been the beginning. The Philippines had fallen, the Dutch East Indies were in Japanese hands, Singapore had surrendered, and Australia was under direct threat of invasion. America desperately needed heroes, symbols that the Japanese Empire was not invincible. Butch was promoted to the rank of lieutenant commander and became the Navy's first fighter ace in World War II, as well as the first naval aviator to receive America's highest military decoration. The official Medal of Honor citation described his action as one of the most daring, if not the most daring, individual actions in the history of aerial combat. Newspapers called him the man who saved the fleet and the lone ace of the Pacific. Hollywood wanted to make a movie about his life. Product manufacturers used his image to sell everything from cigarettes to automobiles. He became the young, heroic face of an America fighting for its survival. But what Butch carried from that day at the White House was not the medal or the promotion or the sudden fame that turned a 28-year-old pilot into the national symbol of American resistance. It was the crystal clear memory of the weight of the lives he had saved and those he had taken, and the deep understanding that true heroism is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act rightly despite it. Every time he looked at the medal, Butch saw not a reward for bravery, but a permanent reminder that 18 Japanese men had died so that 2,900 Americans could live. It was a weight he would carry forever, a responsibility that would shape every decision he made for the rest of his life. The following months were a strange mix of celebrity and existential emptiness. Butch was sent on a war bond tour that took him coast to coast, speaking to crowds at airplane factories, naval shipyards, and patriotic rallies. He hated every minute of it. Not because he didn't believe in the cause, he absolutely believed in the necessity of defeating fascism, but because the people who came to hear him speak expected a Superman, a movie hero who had defeated the enemy without emotional or moral cost. They didn't want to hear about the weight of the dead, the sleepless nights, or how the smell of burnt gunpowder still made him break into a cold sweat months after the battle. They wanted a symbol, not a human being. In June 1942, Butch took command of VF-3, replacing Commander Thach, and was transferred to Maui, Hawaii, where his main responsibility was to train new pilots in the combat tactics he had developed through the most brutal experience possible. Real battle against an enemy determined to kill him. It was important work, but frustrating. How do you teach a 9-year-old boy from Iowa what it means to kill another human being? How do you convey to a farmer's son from Kansas the reality that aerial combat is not a game where you can just hit a reset button when you make a mistake? Butch did the best he could, always emphasizing the importance of discipline, accurate aim, and the ability to remain calm under extreme pressure. Some of his students would go on to become famous aces. Others would die in their first combat missions, brought down by mistakes he had tried to teach them to avoid. The battle on the 20th of February 1942 represented much more than an isolated tactical victory in the vast Pacific theater of operations. It was the first clear sign that the Japanese were not invincible, that their planes could be shot down and their tactics defeated by American pilots with proper training and decent equipment. More importantly, it was the moment when America began to believe in itself again. After Pearl Harbor, the humiliating defeats in the Philippines, the fall of Wake Island, and the surrender of Singapore, the country desperately needed a victory, no matter how small. Butch O'Hare's action gave Americans something to believe in at a time when every news report seemed to bring only bad news. In military terms, Butch's mission demonstrated the effectiveness of the tactics John Thach had developed to compensate for the technical shortcomings of the Wildcat compared to the Zero. By attacking from multiple directions, maintaining high speed, and leveraging the superior armor and concentrated firepower of the American fighter, a skilled pilot could not only survive combat against technically superior Japanese planes, but also defeat them decisively. These lessons were quickly incorporated into training manuals and spread throughout the Pacific Fleet, saving hundreds of American lives in the months and years that followed. Butch O'Hare was never the same man after that day over the Coral Sea. The privilege and innocence of youth had been burned away in the furnace of real combat, replaced by a maturity forged in fire and blood. He became quieter, more introspective, less willing to laugh at his comrades' jokes or attend the parties that were tradition on naval bases. Not out of trauma or depression, Butch never lost his ability to function or lead, but from a deep understanding that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. He had killed men in combat, had taken human lives with his own hands, and that responsibility had changed him in ways only other combat veterans could fully understand. By the end of 1943, now commander of the air group aboard the USS Independence, Butch O'Hare was involved in developing night combat tactics against Japanese torpedo bombers, which had become the greatest threat to American aircraft carriers. It was experimental and dangerous work, flying F-6F Hellcats equipped with primitive radar in near-zero visibility, trying to intercept enemy bombers that attacked like ghosts in the tropical darkness. On the night of the 26th of November 1943, during a mission near Tarawa, Butch O'Hare disappeared. His Hellcat was never found, despite extensive searches. The exact circumstances of his death remain a mystery to this day. But later investigations suggest he was likely shot down by friendly fire from an American TBF Avenger bomber that mistook him for a Japanese attacker in the darkness. The irony was too cruel not to be noticed. The man who had become famous for saving an American aircraft carrier possibly died shot down by planes from his own fleet. But perhaps there was a certain poetic justice in that. Butch had lived his whole life navigating between conflicting identities: the gangster lawyer's son who became a naval hero, the privileged boy who proved his courage under fire, the quiet man who carried the weight of the dead, dying on a mission that symbolized the ambiguous and tragically confusing nature of war seemed fitting for someone who had spent his entire life dealing with moral ambiguities. On the 19th of September 1949, Chicago's municipal airport was renamed O'Hare International Airport in honor of Lieutenant Commander Edward Henry Butch O'Hare. It is one of the few things in Chicago that bears his name, not his father's or Al Capone's. Millions of passengers pass through its gates every year, most without knowing who the man was who lent his name to the airport. But perhaps that's fitting too. Butch never wanted to be famous. He only wanted to prove that he was worthy of the uniform he wore, that he could be judged by his own actions and not by the circumstances of his birth. On that day over the Coral Sea, he achieved that and much more. If this story touched you in any way, consider subscribing. Here you'll always find respect for the men who lived the history we study today.